clip you're about to watch is a clash between two titans. It's Christian apologist Frank Turek versus the great and notorious atheist thinker Christopher Hitchens. He serves some piercing objections to God, and Frank delivers an absolute masterclass of a response. This is one of the best debates I've ever watched, so I highly recommend you watch the full debate down below. Let's get into it.
Suppose we've only been around for 75,000 years. Monotheism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, shows up, what, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago at the most. Right? So if you give me my most microscopically small assumption of human existence, for at least 70,000 years, heaven watches as the human species is born, dies, usually of its teeth, usually at about 20, usually its infants having about a 9, 10, 2% chance of living beyond. I don't have to draw you a picture. Watches this with indifference. Thousands and thousands of generations, miserable, illiterate, starving, hungry. To say nothing of the wars they'll fight with each other, to say nothing of the cruelties they will inflict, as well as the ones they will suffer just from existence. And only 3 or 4, perhaps 5,000 years ago, heaven decides it's enough of that. It's time for an intervention. And the best way to do it would be in the most primitive part of the Middle East, not in China where people can read and have looked at telescopes. No, in the most primitive part of the Middle East, basically by offering human sacrifice to them. This is a doctrine that cannot be believed by anyone who's studied anything scientific, anything historical, anything archaeological, anything paleological, anything biological. Can't be believed by anyone. Can't be only believed by someone who wants to be a plaything and a slave of a pitiless totalitarian power. How glad we should be that the evidence for this ghastly entity is nil. Good. Thanks.
Okay, so there's the setup. It's pretty compelling. Let's see how Frank responds to this, and then I'll give my thoughts.
If there is no God, you can't say that decapitating a man on a bus is objectively morally wrong. That's just your opinion. As Dostoevsky said, if there is no God, everything is permitted. Now, I want to be very clear here. I'm not saying that atheists can't know morality, they do. I'm not saying that atheists can't be moral, they can. I'm not saying that believing in God makes you more moral, as Christopher has pointed out, and as I say, I agree with much of what he writes here. I'm not saying that religious people are necessarily better than atheists. That's not the argument. The argument is that there's no way to say that a given act is moral or immoral unless there's a standard beyond humanity. It's not just my opinion, it's not just Christopher's opinion, or Mother Teresa's or Hitler's. There's a standard beyond everybody that defines what is right. That standard is God's very nature. Since objective moral laws exist, there must be an objective moral lawgiver. You say, no, there doesn't need to be any moral lawgiver. If there's a prescription, there must be a prescriber. If you go to the pharmacist and say, here, I'd like you to fill this prescription, and the pharmacist says, who prescribed it? And you go, nobody. Are you going to get your prescription? No. Now, there's a lot more on the moral argument. Maybe we can talk about a little bit during the Q&A.
So far, it seems like Hitchens has more of less of an intellectual problem with God and more of an emotional problem with God. And this is a really common struggle for a lot of people, especially since, we all deal and struggle with just like terrible things all the time. So I get where Hitchens is coming from, and my heart really goes out to him. I've been in his same spot, but Frank just laid out a pretty compelling argument. So let's see how he goes ahead and responds to Frank.
I find it extraordinary that it can be said on a university campus in this year of grace that without God, humans are capable of doing anything. That there is no moral restraint upon us if we don't concur in the idea that we are the property and creation of a supreme being. I'm making the assumption that all of you check in every now and then with some kind of news outlet and have a view of what's going on in the rest of the world. Isn't it as plain as could be that those who commit the most callous, the most cruel, the most brutal, the most indiscriminate atrocities of all do so precisely because they believe they have divine permission? Shall I answer my own question? Shall I insult you by adding more? Who can't think of an example of this kind? Let me put the question in another form that I've put in now. Every forum from YouTube to C-SPAN, to the wireless, to the print, to the radio, to the television, and innumerable forums to those who say that without God there can be no morality. You are to ask yourself two questions. You are to name a moral action undertaken, or a moral and ethical statement made by a believer. I dare say you can do it. You are then to say that you can not imagine a non-believer making this moral statement or undertaking this moral action. Can you think? Can you now think? Can any of you think? You don't have to answer now. You have all night, and you have my email. And I've done this with everyone from the Archbishop of Canterbury to even lower people. You name me the ethical and moral action or statement that a believer can make and an unbeliever cannot, and there's a prize. And I'll tell you about that later. Now there's a second question. Think of something wicked that only a believer would be likely to do, or something wicked that only a believer would be likely to say. You've already thought of it. The suicide bombing community is entirely religious. The genital mutilation community is entirely religious. I wouldn't say that the child abuse community is entirely religious. I wouldn't. But it's bidding to be entirely religious. It operates on the old Latin slogan, "No child's behind left." How dare anybody, how dare anyone who speaks for religion say of us, the secular and the non-believers, that we are the immoral ones? It is itself a wicked thing to say. Itself an absolutely indefensible thing to say. No, the decapitation on the bus is going to be done by someone who thinks God is telling him to do it. Smerdyakov is actually the stupidest character in Dostoevsky's novel. He's the one who makes this proposition. Everyone has to understand that it is those who feel that the divine is prompting them, who feel they're permitted anything and everything. And it is those who are the leading, most salient, most violent, most vicious opponents of the values and civilization that Thomas Jefferson stood for and promulgated.
Okay. Hitchens has a point. Many atrocities have been committed in the name of religion. However, he also fails to mention that many atrocities have also been committed by atheist communities as well. Let's not forget about Stalin's forced famines that killed tens of millions of people in Russia, or Mao's reign in China with the tyranny and the death camps, and the 36 million people that were tortured and persecuted by him. It seems that the root cause of these atrocities, whether they're by atheist communities or Christian communities or whatever religion, the root cause comes down to our sinful human condition, our propensity to do evil, and not so much whether somebody's atheist or theist. But let's see what Frank has to say to all this.
He went on to talk about atrocities, and I think he again missed my point. As I said before, I'm not saying atheists can't be moral. Christopher, what he says in his book again, much of it is true. Religious people have done awful things. In fact, Christianity predicts we'll be hypocrites. That's what the church is. It's full of hypocrites. Whenever somebody says, I don't want to go to church, there's too many hypocrites down there, I always say, come on down, pal, we got room for one more. That's what the church is. We're all fallen, we're all sinners. That's why we need a Savior, because we can't do it. And Christopher said, well, how can you command somebody to be well when they have no capacity to be well? Well, we were well in the beginning, and I'm going into Christian theology here, I understand. I'll just try and answer the point. We were well in the beginning, but then we messed up, and so God, the great physician, came back to save us. That's Christian theology. As again, I don't have time to support it. I'm just pointing out that is the theology. Now, Christopher talked about atrocities, but again, on the atheistic worldview, here's the main point. How do you define what an atrocity is? Who defines it? Who has the authority to define what an atrocity is? The carbon atom? The benzene molecule? I'm not saying you have to believe in God to be moral. I'm not saying that only religious people are moral. I'm not saying atheists can't be moral. I'm not saying atheists don't know morality. I'm saying there's no way to justify what is right and what is wrong unless there's some authority that provides it. What is the authority? In a materialistic worldview, there is no authority. The carbon atom has no moral authority over you. And it seems that Christopher goes on and on about how he does not want to be under some kind of divine totalitarianism. That is a moral rejection of God. Where does he come up with this immoral totalitarianism? His worldview does not afford immorality, because his worldview does not afford morality. He has to borrow from the Christian worldview in order to argue against it. In fact, he has to sit in God's lap to slap his face.
Frank really just hit the nail on the head there at the end when he said that Hitchens has to borrow from Christianity, which basically means that any moral objection that Hitchens makes about God is merely his subjective opinion. Now, before C.S. Lewis became a Christian, he said that his argument against God was that the universe just seemed so cruel and unjust, which is very similar to what Hitchens is putting down in this argument. But C.S. Lewis, he wondered, how did he get this idea of just or unjust? And what was he comparing this universe to when he called it unjust? And of course, he could have just given up the idea of justice by saying that, it was just a matter of his personal taste, his personal idea. But if he did that, he'd be throwing out his whole argument against God. It just collapsed because it depended on him being able to say that the universe was unjust and that the suffering was cruel and not right. But that depiction just doesn't really sit well with me, and I don't think it should sit well with you either, because I believe that deep in our hearts, we know that the world is filled with evil and filled with injustice. We know that murdering innocent children is just absolutely wrong. We abhor sex trafficking. We detest ethnic cleansing. These aren't just personal tastes of ours. This is something deeper. This is a moral framework that is written deep in our conscience by a moral lawgiver. And so ironically, suffering actually provides a better argument supporting God than against God. And if God is real, that would have some serious implications today. I mean, it would mean that it doesn't matter if you're rich, poor, young, old, black, white, Hispanic, Muslim, gay, straight, bi. It would mean that you are valuable no matter what you do, no matter who you are, because you're made in the image of God, the likeness of God. You're not just matter or energy without a purpose, because there's a God who loves you, who loves me, who gives us value. And I don't know where you stand on your belief in God, but there's an important question I want to ask you, and that's, if God were real, would you want to know him? And I want you to think about that, because God actually makes a promise to us that if you truly seek after him with all of your heart, he will reveal himself to you. And I was an atheist 10 months ago, and when I heard that promise or all this, I just thought it was kind of crazy talk. But I'm telling you that if you actually want to find God and you do it with all your heart, he'll show himself to you. Remember that. Have a blessed day.